Talkback, proudly supported by Number One Super Limited. I'm Stephen Mase, and it's good to be with you. We're counting down the days to our independence, and today being the 3rd, I think that leaves us about 12 or 13 more days. And of course, the conversations are around independence. This morning, it's my pleasure to have in the studio the Emerging Leaders Dialogue Alumni. Now, this is a program where, in collaboration with Papua New Guinea and the Australian government, they talk to emerging leaders. I'm going to introduce Oliver Nobetau, who runs this program. He's going to tell us a little bit about it, and then we'll introduce our guests. So on that note, Oliver, good morning.
Thank you, Stephen. Good morning, and thank you very much for having us this morning. Like was mentioned for our viewers, my name is Oliver Nobetau, and I'm the project director for the Aus-PNG network at the Lowy Institute. And just a little bit about what the network does. It's a public diplomacy program that is focused on strengthening people-to-people connection between communities and individuals across PNG and Australia. It's funded by the Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and it's run underneath the Lowy Institute. And our flagship event that we do every year is called the Emerging Leaders Dialogue, as you had mentioned, where we bring together 10 emerging leaders from Australia and Papua New Guinea to come together for a week-long dialogue to talk about issues of mutual concern between our countries. And we have two of our alumni with us today, Hansley, who is an alumni from this year's ELD, and Laurele from 2022. And this year in particular, the topic that we talked about was shared history, shared future, the next 50 years of the Australia-PNG relationship. Well, we wanted to get perspectives on how do we really frame this relationship moving forward. And as part of the discussion on this relationship with Australia, we also had to take a moment of reflection to talk about our independence and our own reflections on how we feel we have done. And hopefully we can use this time today to get the views of our ELD alumni here and yourself, and I guess me too, if I can jump in, on the views of our upcoming independence. As you said, it's coming up very close, and we're quite excited. So I think as a brief, that's sort of what we do over at the Aus-PNG Network. Once again, thank you so much to you and NBC, No One Super for sponsoring the Talkback show as well. We're very excited to be here, so that's from me. So I guess, back to you, Stephen.
Thank you, Oliver. Oliver is, of course, also a proud Papua New Guinean, and great to have people working at a research think tank like the Lowy here with us today.
Thank you.
So we've got Hansley Gumbaketi and Laurele Pentanu. And I think it's best that we ask them to introduce themselves and what their specialty is. But of course, they're very proud to be part of the Emerging Leaders Dialogue Alumni. Let's start off with you, Hansley, and welcome to our program.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you everyone for having me on the show. My name is Hansley Gumbaketi. I work in...
Where are you from?
Yeah,
where are you from? Yes.
I would consider myself a Sipik from Morobe. So we're part of the diaspora. I grew up in LA before going abroad to pursue further studies. And that's kind of led me into working in town planning. So my background's in urban planning, urban development, yes, or what have you. A topic that I think is quite important to the nation's development, although my focus really is on the city and the city's growth, and hopefully I can talk a bit about that and reflect on that during our session today. So yeah.
Always wanted to talk to town planners. Great. Laurele, tell me a little bit about yourself and a bit of your background.
Okay, thank you, Stephen. I am from Bougainville. My father's from Bougainville, my mother's from Manus. Grew up here, finished university here, University of Papua New Guinea. My first career choice was with the government, Department of Foreign Affairs, 9 years. Then I went on to private entrepreneurship back home in Bougainville. And more recently, trying my hand in the private sector. I'm still getting used to that. I don't think I have any research background yet, but I have enjoyed being a beneficiary of the Lowy Institute and the policies that have been formulated during the time we've been part of this ELD program.
Okay, well, it's great to have you here as well, Laura. So, a former diplomat, that's interesting as well. But more importantly, in the space I understand you're in tourism as well, and that's important. We'll talk a little bit about that. Let's start off. Our opening questions are reflections on independence. Hansley, what are your thoughts? 50 years on reflections on independence. What does it mean to you personally?
Look, I think I'm quite grateful that we've had the opportunity. I think that's the first thing I'll always talk about, regardless of where we are and what our hopes are for the future. But I always kind of take it with a grain of salt when there's a lot of complaints about what's not working or what should be happening. I think a point of wisdom for me is that, yes, it's been 50 years, but it is still only 50 years. And I think that's a quite significant point for me, because it means that we shouldn't, I try not to hold everything to a high standard, knowing that for a long time other nations have tried to define us. And I think for the first time, the hope that I have is that we can start to see what hasn't worked and start rebuilding for the next 50 years, if that makes any sense. And if this other part of the reflection that I often try to have is on what our urban future looks like, and I do stress the point, because I think it's important for Papua New Guineans to realize that we are a rapidly urbanizing society. Yes. In our rural areas as well as our cities and towns. And I think we are working towards trying to bridge that gap. And I'm very hopeful that there are going to be policy positions that the government will take in the future on what our urban future looks like. And I think that's a huge hope for Papua New Guineans. We can talk a little bit more about that later, but there's a few key talking points there.
Yeah. Thank you for that, Hansley. I think you've said an important point. There is an expectation from all of us as Papua New Guineans, and I guess it's an expectation that sort of it's very demanding in terms of all of the challenges that are happening around us. And we want to see so much development. You talked about urbanization, delivery of service and goods, even into town areas, and the growing numbers, the population that's really affecting, standards of living. So we can only, I'm sure you're going to touch on this on a professional basis about what's happening in cities and towns. But you can imagine what's happening in rural areas where they don't have running water, good electricity, all that type of thing. So we'll come back to you. But thank you for your observations. Laurele, your thinking, your reflection about 50 years of independence for Papua New Guinea. You're a Bougainvillean, you're a female, you're an emerging leader. Your thoughts?
For me, I've been thinking about it more in the last, I think they've had a lot of events leading up.
If you don't want to speak up a little bit. Sorry. Yeah, just speak up a little bit.
So in the last, I think, 6 months, they've had a lot of events here in Port Moresby leading up to, it's a culmination, right, leading up to the 16th of September. Yes. But I think for me, it's become more apparent in the last 2 weeks. And I've had really to stop and had some time to really reflect on what independence really means. For me, it's just, I think it's a reflection, firstly. Secondly, I think a sense of pride, but also gratefulness. I've had this, actually the last weekend, just reflecting, and I've seen, I think, the difference between old leaders or past leaders, founding fathers or mothers of the nation, and having that time over the weekend too to really have a look at where this leadership would lie or what it will mean going forward in the next 50 years, for example. So it's been a time of reflection, and I think gratefulness, because through that reflection, I was able to realize, these our grandfathers or fathers or mothers, they came from from the village, and they were able to, be trailblazers, overcome, traditional life and break into Western civilization and the way of living. So that was gratefulness for me with that as well. So I think it's a time of reflection. As a Bougainvillean, there's a lot of history with Bougainville, and I think more recently it's surfacing. But I think that's something that the media, but also the government, they need to capture later down the line as well. But a beautiful country, 50 years, and hoping that we can have sort of a hard stop, and hoping future leaders can really plan out what should or be in store for the next 50, and really base that on what's happening globally. So Papua New Guinea becomes more of a contributor to the globe, rather than just being sort of very I don't know what the right word is, but
Cocoon, baby.
Cocooned within our own.
Yeah. But thank you, Laurel. I mean, 3 things I take away from what you've just said. Gratitude. Papua New Guineans need to be grateful. Pride, of course, we've all got that, and most importantly, leadership. Just very quickly, before I know Oliver's also wanting to ask so many questions, but what do both of you see as some of the country's biggest achievements, and maybe some of the biggest lessons we can learn from the last 50 years?
Tough questions, eh?
Thanks to Oliver.
Look, I think I'm going to touch on something Laurele mentioned, trailblazers.
Mm-hmm.
What really, I guess, astounds me about the nation is anyone who does something that they don't know another Papua New Guinean has done it before, you can be certain you're a trailblazer, and you're the first of a nation of 8 million people or plus to do that, which I think is like something that's quite unique. You're either the first to fail or the first to succeed at anything you do. For me, I think that is like a sense of, it gives me a great sense of optimism. Sorry, what the other question was?
Well, the biggest lessons we should take from the past 50 years, the biggest achievements, and maybe some of the biggest lessons we've learned.
Look, I think the biggest lesson for me going forward is that we should be willing to live and die by our own sword. I think we're so afraid as Papua New Guineans, as policymakers, to make mistakes. And I think we've, for the longest time, been paralyzed by the fear of making mistakes. I think what I've seen with the recent crop of political leaders anyway is a willingness to try new things. That gives me a great sense of hope. There's really encouraging young leaders coming through the ranks, and not only political leaders, but also through our business lives.
Yes. Yeah.
And we should give credit to a lot of our business leaders as well, young Papua New Guineans. So look, I'm very hopeful for the future. There are signs that we're doing something that hasn't been done before, and we're experimenting with different things and policies, and that's something that I'm looking forward to, and at least for the remainder of my lifetime.
Good on you, Hansel. Laurel, what about your thoughts? Lessons learned, and maybe some of our biggest achievements.
Thanks, Stephen. I think lessons learned, I think one is, really ownership. I think in terms of the country, I think, when we received independence, but in the last 50 years, we've grown as people. We've come together as much as we possibly can and have.
As diverse as we are.
As diverse as we are. To really, gain ownership of really truly what's ours. Yes. I think that's one of the biggest lessons learned, as opposed to pre-independence. And I think that also, part of that answer comes from my heritage as well, from Bougainville. But I think that's one of the main lesson learned is, I think, ownership. We've learned to take ownership of what's ours, our resources, our people, and we continue to try. Achievements, I think we've grown quite a bit as a nation. You have other states or countries or nations worldwide who have had hundreds of years to really develop. But Papua New Guinea, I think in my view, has grown quite a lot in a short span of 50 years. We've been pushed from wearing graskes loples, suits now, looking very suave. So I think we've grown, quite a bit. So I think that's one of our biggest achievements, and as diverse as we are, as you mentioned.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Laurel. Oliver, I know you've got questions around leadership and development. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Stephen, and thank you to both of you. I think our conversation has organically sort of shifted to this topic of leadership, which is what I wanted to talk about. And I think we can take away sort of two main things. Either that is sort of the biggest thing that we can rely on, leadership moving forward, or that's the biggest problem that we need to fix, right? Because all conversations that you have, I think, nowadays talks about leadership, right? And this is a topic we can spend the whole day talking about and exploring. So I'll try as much as possible to keep it refined and sort of stick to the questions that I prepared. But one of the things the themes that you guys have talked about, really leadership, and as participants of the ELD alumni, I wanted to talk and gauge your views on sort of the role of young leaders sort of shaping the rest of Papua New Guinea. I like to think of the situation where we are now and people of our sort of cohort and age group, and I think back 50 years and people who would have been the age of Michael Somara, who would have been so excited, for a new nation that was about to be born. And there's almost that sense of excitement as well that's in the air, not just for a 50-year mark, but I think it also represents a moment in time where we can sort of pick up the pen and start writing a new story moving forward, right? Picking up from the lessons that I've learned, as Stephen had just probed on now. I view sort of young people, sometimes we put leadership on a pedestal, this sort of personality leadership, but I think everyone is a leader in their own right. And everyone has a role to play in our nation story moving forward. The same way that, Laurele, you mentioned our forefathers were sort of custodians of the country for us, we are now sort of in the position where we are custodians for a future generation coming up as well. So I wanted to sort of probe your thoughts on that and say, what do you see is the role of young people now in PNG society? What is the obligation or role that they have now in shaping the rest of Papua New Guinea? Laurele, sorry, I guess I'll start with you.
Thanks, Ollie. I think the role they play now really, in my view, it really comes down to, for me, it's a generational thing. Sorry, for lack of better term thing. Our forefathers have set the foundation. So what are the future leaders going to do now to take that to the next level? And as I mentioned, to be global citizens, to add more value as a nation to the rest of the globe. So whether that may be through media, through social media, through breaking new boundaries or breaking barriers by being the first, female to gain a master's in rocket science or what have you not. I think leadership going forward should be about that, really adding value to what has already been set, or the foundation that's been set by those forefathers that we mentioned him, yeah.
Hansley, please.
I think Laurel's kind of hit the nail on the head with what I think young leaders, at least a new crop of leaders, need to devote a bit of their time towards, is being more open-minded and looking outward. I think we've spent the last 50 years rather, looking inward. I've been privileged enough to spend time abroad and studied abroad, and one of the things I've kind of looked back on the country from outside is that we still, or at least we were, rather insular for a lot of the time, for a long, long time. You ask any Papua New Guinean, and I think it's fair to say we feel like the world revolves around Papua New Guinea. And maybe it does, I'm not sure, I can't say it doesn't, but I think the next crop of leaders realize that in order to become part of the global economy or wherever, whatever you want to call it, we need to be more willing to engage with the outside world and feel like we're capable of doing that. I think we are. And I'll speak on about the private sector, where I spent a bit of time working, and I think there's a lot of young, aspiring, energetic, but crucially smart and capable leaders in that space who any day of the week can hold their own on the international stage. So I think that's probably where I see the role of young leaders emerging and changing, going forward. Takes the weight of the load off politicians anyway. When you have.
Can I just get a quick one in?
Of course.
And I know this is your segment, but
No.
I just wanted to ask you this, from what both of you are talking about, and even Oliver. Some of us have been lucky enough to have an education abroad as well, or been exposed to that. I want to talk about leadership. I'll ask about leadership and education, because I think our country's level of education needs to be really looked at. I think, Laurele, you mentioned a hard reset. That's the word everybody's talking about. The education system in our country needs to get up to a level where we can really compete with others around the region, around the globe. But what are your thoughts as young people, as young leaders? You know, we can build people up, but the education capacity.
Yeah, thanks for that. Look, it has occupied a lot of my thinking recently, talking to another colleague from the ELD, my cohort, who's been in the education space. It is something that is important, no doubt. Education is a core pillar of our development. What needs to change? Look, I sit on the side of the debate that says we should be investing in our teachers. Fair enough. I also sit on the side equally of people who think that we should be creating more opportunities for the current students to tap into. I don't think we have really capable students in our secondary school systems who, for whatever reason, don't get placement but are still capable. Our vocational schools probably don't do enough. I'm not sure what the answer is there, but I always kind of try to reimagine what a system would look like. Maybe it is trying to see, well, is there a way to tap into other systems, bring them in? We've got the GCSE systems that are in PNG. We don't have an international bachelorette program. These are different education systems that I think would complement the PNG system. But for kids who are wanting to, take that next step of saying, let's go apply for a scholarship to go overseas, for example, the PNG education system might not work for them to do that. There's a bunch of other steps that they need to step through. But having access to like an IB or a GCSE system, or even a US SAT high school system, if we had access to those in PNG, it wouldn't solve the problem, but it would help make accessibility or give people more options. Yeah, that's just from my perspective anyway.
Laurel, very quickly.
Yeah, I do agree. Accessibility is very important for education in the future, leadership, and future population. I also believe that I think the PNG curriculum and the system really needs to be revamped, or it needs to be a real, since we're saying an overhaul. Yeah, it really needs to be done. And as I mentioned earlier, it's a time of reflection. So really stop to really think, okay, which policies, which systems are working, which may not be working. How can we tailor it to suit the future? We may need to omit some, get rid of some. So I do think that, I think the PNG education system, it needs to be re-looked at going forward. And I think we need to also impart a lot of what we've learned in the last 50 years, in the sense that, you know, the Western system has probably not worked the best, or it's worked to its full capacity. Now we need to impose some of what we've learned in terms of how we do things here, culturally and within the country. I think that will be more suited to running a good country or having a good another 50 years ahead of us.
Thank you.
Thank you. And I guess I'll just really quickly reflection before I ask sort of my last sort of questions. I'll sort of condense them. On the education part as well, you're right. I think it does need a complete overhaul. I think we also need to change the way that we look at education and the purpose that it serves, particularly in terms of nation building. Traditional institutions are there, they're good, but I think, you know, like Laurele said, how we're going to contribute on a global level has to change how we look at education. My own path was different. I sort of I was in Australia during my formative years of school when my family lived there, came back here, finished off primary school, high school. When I was going into university, I wanted to go and study over at JCU. But my parents couldn't afford to send me there, right? It was really expensive. So I made the point to show that I went to School of Law, UPNG, and I got my bachelor's degree there. And I think I wanted to show as a personal goal to be that you can still be educated in a PNG system and still be able to perform at a really high level, like what Hansley had mentioned. So it's been a personal sort of mission of mine to try and demonstrate that. But I work now for the Lowy Institute, and I think it's really interesting. The founder, if anyone wants to look into him, is Frank Lowy, who had moved to Australia, and he wasn't formally educated. Before I met him, he's the one who started up all the Westfield malls that you would see in Australia. He's the founder and the owner of those. I don't know if he's owner anymore, but I'll have to check that out, confirm that. But when I was looking at one of his previous interviews before I met him, and I was sort of doing some background research, he made a statement where he said he's not formally educated. And for him, he said the important thing is not education, but it's about having the ability to educate yourself, right? And I think we have really smart and capable Papua New Guineans. We just need to be able to show them that there's a way where you can learn about the things that you want to learn about. It doesn't always have to be in a classroom or in a formal setting, right? Because we don't have the capacity to cater for that. So sort of those are the reflections on the education question. But just to condense really quickly, and because I would really love to get through all the other questions, I'll throw two questions and answer which one you feel you're more comfortable with on the leadership question as well. Firstly, if you want to share about this specific sector or field of expertise that you operate in, what's the progress PNG has made since independence, and where do we need to do better? I know you mentioned town planning. You might want to talk about that, Hansley. But the other thing as well, which might be fun to talk about, is sort of what's the most pressing challenge you see for the country that needs to resolve as we hit 50 years. Yeah, so
either one, take your pick.
So Hansley, I'll probably start with you, man.
Yeah. I'm not trying to pass the ball around. I am going to say city planning.
As the biggest challenge, or the question you're...
As the biggest challenge, when I say PNG is urbanizing, I mean, we have, from the last census figures that we can kind of draw from, I think PNG was the fastest urbanizing Pacific Island nation country. And this is not a reflection of our cities getting bigger. This is people all across the island of the Pacific Island, across Papua New Guinea. I mean, there's different schools of thoughts on this, and we won't get too academic about it. But the fact that people have access to mobile phones in the rural areas means that we're on the verge of like seeing a huge change in how we perceive ourselves as rural people and as Papua New Guinea. So that's the huge thing. Infrastructure is a huge thing to cater for that for me. We talk about, and I was talking to a friend of mine just before I came in. For me, it's not about what you see being built. It's the infrastructure, the policy infrastructure behind that, whether we can finance that, whether we have the capacity to maintain that. All of the above comes down to whether we have the right policy infrastructure in place. And I don't think we have that at the moment. Yeah.
Laurele?
On urban
What
planning
do you feel? So, your sector or field, would you either that, or what do you think really is the pressing challenge that we need to resolve?
Yeah, I think I really do think education. I really believe that education is the key to a better future. that sounds very generic, but I think it's very important. And then after that, the quality of leaders, training good leaders. I think you had in-service college, or I think it's called the Samar Institute now. Silag. I think it's also a very important institution in terms of really mentoring or grooming good future leaders, because those leaders are the ones essentially that will go into parliament and then make those policies or pass those policies. And, policy will always outlive political will, whether we like it or not, and the institutions will always outlive political will. So I think that's also a pressing challenge that we have. So education, and then just mentoring and grooming the new crop of leaders for the next 50 or 100 years to come. I also think the other one would probably be challenges, right? This is challenges here. I think unity. I also believe that it's important to keep the country intact. Again, as a Bougainvillean, you can see a lot of the dynamics and what's going on now. You look at Mosem, there's a lot of talk about political will and breaking away. I think it's a unique case, and I think Bougainville has its reasons, valid reasons. But I also think it's very important that if we want to excel, or if we want to put ourselves at that global level, you really need to keep the nation or the country intact going forward. So you need to keep everybody united.
Thank you. I'll hand it back to you, Stephen.
Thank you to the both of you. As Laurel, your answer, coming back to education, as basic and fundamental as it is, I think that's where some of us have sort of lost the plot along the way. And I know people have been talking about a hard reset. This word has come about ever since people have been talking about independence. But as basic and fundamental as it is, we really need to look at it. It's critical. It's critical. The other thing, and I find this interesting, what you've just mentioned about unity. We hear it in the songs. As a people, when you're abroad, I'm sure, when you see a fellow Papua New Guinean, we're Papua New Guineans. We're not, Yublo Buka or Miblo Highlands or Wanema, Miblo Morobe. No, and as citizens of this country, we need to understand that we're Papua New Guineans at a global level. Vision for the future. I know time's running, so we'll try to. What's your vision for PNG in the next 50 years? And what could be a priority for national leaders today? It's two questions in one.
Vision for the future. There's one particular line of thought that I've been quite intrigued by, and this is a conversation that I've been having with different people, and that's the question around where Papua New Guinea sees itself in the wider region, Pacific region. I'm curious to see what conversations around integration of the Pacific could look like, Pacific regionalism. I think Ollie's done a bit of work around this with our relationship with Australia. I think that's an interesting road to take with how our relationship with Australia evolves. I do understand that's going to be a big political issue for the current crop of national leaders to deal with, because that comes with its own hang-ups and baggage and what have you. So I think that's an interesting one. The other one I'm curious about is the Bougainville question that I'm hoping we'll get a chance to touch on. So I'll just leave it at that because I don't want to spend too much time.
Thanks, Stephen. What was that again? The vision?
Your vision for PNG in the next 50 years, and if you could recommend one priority for national leaders, what would that be?
Okay.
What's a national priority?
Thanks. I think my vision for PNG I think it would be really to be self-sufficient or still sustainable 50 years from now. And that just you asking that question, in my mind, I'm thinking food security, the way technology is developing globally, I think it's important that we're able to take care of our population. If things, go sideways globally. I want to be able to know that in my country, I'm still able to eat. I'm still able to, access healthcare. So I think that's important in the next 50 years. Like you mentioned, just those fundamental and those important areas. That's for...
Yes. If I can also just touch on something you've mentioned, and I know this was in the last response, but how you mentioned about urbanization and how it's so fast and growing in our own country and what we can see, and especially what's happening we all come from villages. A village 50 years ago to a village today is totally different. And what Laurele has highlighted is something that you touched on, technology, the influence of a mobile phone coming into, what used to be people telling stories on the local legends. All of a sudden, you've got YouTube and what on a mobile phone. I mean, of course, it's going to influence how a young mind thinks through their education, and obviously some things that used to be important in the past, people will be like, oh, no, I'd rather. So yes, this is probably one of the challenges that we're grappling with, and our young people, especially going through an education system. What's important? What's real? And maybe that is a good segue into the next question very quickly. How important are people-to-people links with generations, with provinces, even international partners such as Australia, strengthening Papua New Guinea over the next 50 years? So people-to-people relationships. Laurele, I'm sure as a former diplomat, you would really understand what this means.
Yeah, I think it comes back to, I think what you mentioned as well on technology. I think it's a lot to do with responsibility.
Yeah.
So using technology responsibly for the right reasons, education, right? And then into future, into ties, also responsibility. You have a responsibility or a duty as well as a Papua New Guinean, as mentioned, your forefathers have laid the foundation, for the future. So it's the onus is on you as well to add value. So you're responsible and you have a duty to also add that, or add that value going forward, which means doing what you have to do, upskilling, getting a good education, doing what you have to do to maintain those important relationships and ties. So I think it comes down to responsibility as an individual.
Hansley?
I don't think I can add much more than that. I mean, I agree. Like, ultimately, it comes down to the individual. Which is sad because it takes a village to raise a person, right? So it's also the village. Yeah, look, I'm not going to dwell on that question. I want to move on to...
Please ask that question. I know it's one of the burning ones around Bougainville. And it's a good thing that young people, emerging leaders are understanding. Thank you, Oliver.
And I just wanted to also just share on the reflection you said. It's really profound what you just talked about in terms of the village not looking the same. Because it's true. From like what we had, Saksak house now, and then we're having like semi-permanent, permanent houses. And I was just thinking to myself, like the view of what the village is, sooner or later it's going to urbanize, and how much longer until we can't call it a village anymore? I don't know, right? That's something I want to be thinking about for the rest of the day, I think. But yeah, so I guess just moving on, segue into the question on the Bougainville stuff. Today in the Parliament, I think Prime Minister Marpa is set to make a reconciliation statement. The UN Secretary General is in town as well, and they're going to have a meeting with President Tororama and PNG, and this is Prime Minister. And this has been a defining moment in our history for the past 50 years, the Bougainville crisis. And I guess I wanted to get your views as sort of the emerging leaders of the future PNG. And it's good that we can sort of have a balanced sort of take on this. But in terms of the Bougainville question, I just released a paper yesterday which talked about reframing the partnership. What are your views on how do you think that we should characterize this Bougainville PNG partnership moving forward over the next 50 years? Or how would you like to see it being framed when we refer to it or when we talk about it? And I guess I'll start off with you, Hansley, first.
Firstly, I should qualify that my only qualification to speak on this is because my uncle fought was in Bougainville, but on the PNG side.
Same here.
Yes.
Yeah.
So it's not foreign to, I think, a lot of Papua New Guineans, my generation, to know the issue firsthand, which probably means that it won't go away anytime soon. And even if, when, or however Bougainville progresses in the relationship with PNG, will probably be one of the most important relationships from a Bougainville perspective, but also from a Papua New Guinean perspective. And a few weeks ago, when Oli and I were in a separate panel, I shared that what we don't realize is we're essentially introducing a new state into this world. And I don't think it's a profound statement, because we don't know how to grapple with having a new country in the world. It's not just, by chance that Secretary General Gutierrez is in town. The political implications of having a new Bougainville state, I think PNG doesn't really understand how to treat that yet. I mean, we're still grappling with issues pre-independence, with different breakaway movements, in which we've spoken about unity. It's something that I don't think a lot of leaders have I don't want to use the word capacity, but the aptitude to think about what this issue really means for them at a local level. So I think, if I was to say, what does it look like? I think we have to play it day by day after the moment independence is granted. I always look at the issue that's currently going on between New Zealand and the Cook Island, and what that relationship of dependency looks like. It's scary to think that they're not having the best of times at the moment. Yeah. So it's a hopeful relationship to think that we can have a working relationship, but it's also scary because it holds Bougainville back from a lot of other things that it might not necessarily think of yet. Yeah, sorry. That's just...
Yeah,
Great. Yeah. Sorry, just ask the question again.
Oh, no, just a question on sort of, we're at a time now where we're moving towards sort of, I guess some people think resolving the Bougainville situation, but like you said, it's not going away. But in your view, how would you, I just released a paper yesterday on sort of reframing the partnership, but I guess moving forward over the next 50 years or even more immediate terms, how would you like to see the relationship characterized or reframed, or the partnership between PNG, the national government, and Bougainville?
Yeah, thanks, Oli. I think really, as Hansley has mentioned, it's difficult to really put your finger on it now. I think it's going to be a long process going into the future, but I think it should really right now be characterized as strengthening or what's the right word to use? Revitalizing relationships.
Yeah, sure.
Because what has happened in the past is that this is had a crisis, and I mean, really ties have communication has broken down for a long time. So I think really characterizing it, I think it would be a relationship of rebuilding or revitalizing it and really rebuilding trust, I think. Mm-hmm. And things have changed in the last 36 years since the Bougainville crisis. And, going forward, and PNG's priorities and policies have changed as well. So it's really looking at whether Bougainville would like to jump on that bandwagon with PNG, or, as we keep talking about or mentioning, there's a hard reset needed, whether we go back to the start and say, okay, look, the crisis has happened. Things are not the same. Okay, what are we going to do going forward now? But I really think it's about rebuilding trust at this time, at this juncture.
Sure. Cool. Thank you.
Thank you, Laurele. Thank you, Hansley, and thank you, Oliver, for bringing both of these young emerging leaders. I think just very quickly, one thing you talked about, and I'm also interested in reading this paper you've put out. People have been talking about autonomy, greater autonomy, and even in Papua New Guinea, this issue about decentralization. So yes, I have to agree with you, Hansley. It's not going to go away soon. The issue is not going to go away soon, but we all just have to be committed to it, I guess, on both sides, and work through it, as you said, probably on a day-to-day basis. It's been my pleasure. Oliver Nobetau, who is the director of the Australian PNG Network, and sitting alongside him, Hansley Gumbaketi. His specialty is in urban development, but he's a Emerging Leaders Dialogue alumni, and of course, Laurele Pentanu, a former diplomat, but also now in the Bougainville tourism space. Thank you so much for all coming in and being part of our NBC Talkback program. Thank you.
Thank you so
Thank
much
you,
for having us, Stephen.
Stephen.
It was a pleasure.
Yeah, we look forward to another one on Friday.
Of course.
And we have to cross over to Parliament very shortly. That's why we'll wrap up our session here. That's been another program of NBC Talkback. Hope you've been empowered and educated, and it's got you thinking as well. On the next edition, I look forward to talking more about our emerging leaders. Until then, I'm Stephen Mase, and have a good day.
NBC Talkback Show. Proudly brought to you by #1 Super. For everyone.